This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Livestock economist Derrell Peel from Oklahoma State University kicks off today's show with a cattle market update. He talks about the current conditions as well as the recent cattle on feed report. Continuing the show is K-State's Susan Metzger and Dorivar Ruiz Diaz to talk about the Fertilizer Research Fund and how it supports producers. Reminding people to leave wildlife alone with K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts ends today's show. He talks about how wildlife adapts to their conditions and the issues people could cause if they try to interact with them. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update. And this week we're joined by Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. Derrell, thanks for joining us today.
You bet. Good morning to you.
Derrell, starting our cattle market conversation with what is cash looking like?
Well, markets are really hard to assess right now. Coming out of the holiday, January always takes a couple of weeks to kind of get a beat on it. And then, of course, we've had so much winter weather disruptions here lately. It's really hard to get a beat on things. I think, the fed cattle market is looking a little bit stronger because, we've had disruptions. We've not been able to move cattle. And so, there's some short-term dynamics there going on. Feeder cattle markets, at least in Oklahoma, a bunch of them have been closed most of the time since the holidays, or maybe they were open 1 week. So it's really hard to get a read on it at this point in time. And I think, the winter weather probably is the bigger story at this point.
Are we seeing some of those similar impacts for futures?
Yeah, a little bit. The futures market, I think, has reacted a bit. Feeder cattle future, well, all of the both feeder and the live cattle, I think, are still kind of following through from last fall with, trying to sort of consolidate a bottom after the big correction we had in the fourth quarter of last year. And we've seen some strength. They've actually looked a little bit stronger here lately. I think some of that short term due to these weather things, as well as, longer term, we are kind of getting a little bit of a solid footing under this market. I think it'll be another, again, in another few days, we'll probably have a better sense of sort of what the real direction of the market is.
So for a lot of things, just still recovering from the recent weather temperatures and conditions we've had?
I tell you what, we've had a lot of weather issues. For fed cattle, you can go all the way back to that storm that hit the plains, down as far as at least mid-Kansas right after Christmas. That affected a lot of feedlot country. Cattle have been off feed. We are seeing weights starting to come down. The most recent weekly dressed weights showed a decline. Now, they should be declining this time of the year anyway, seasonally. But, we'll probably see more of those impacts in the coming weeks. And then since then, we've had more cold weather, more snow. And so clearly from a fed cattle market standpoint, there will be some implications there in terms of those weights and overall production. Once you lose fed cattle production in a storm, you really never get it back. And so it's just kind of gone away. Those cattle sit there. They're either not gaining any weight or in some cases going backwards. And so that really has an impact that I think we'll see probably for several more weeks as we go forward. Feeder cattle markets, again, we haven't had a lot of market action just because nobody wants to move cattle or mess with cattle in these kind of markets or in these kind of weather. Yeah, obviously cattlemen have been extremely busy trying to deal with the cold weather, chopping ice, keeping cattle watered, getting extra feed out, and so on. So lots of issues that way.
And Derrell, what are we seeing for box beef?
The box beef market, again, coming out of the holidays, it dropped sharply in the first week of January. And that was really just kind of a post-holiday pipeline effect. I think, everybody was trying to clean up any leftover supplies of box beef they had. So it was kind of a fire sale thing, and box beef dropped sharply. And then that was hit immediately with these disruptions due to weather. A couple of packing plants lost a day of production. And so now we've seen in the last 2 weeks, choice box beef has gone up about $20 a hundredweight. So it's back up near to $3 a hundredweight. Again, some of that's very short run effects. And as we go forward, I think, again, it's probably going to take another week or two before we maybe have a little bit more of a longer run sense of what this market is really, what the direction is going forward.
And Derrell, wanting to cover a report that came out this past Friday, the Cattle on Feed report, and what did you see from there?
Yeah, the January cattle on feed report, in terms of the usual monthly cattle on feed report, really, certainly was consistent with expectations. This one was nailed right on with the pre-report estimates. So we had placements in December at about 96% of a year ago. Marketings came in at about 99% of a year ago. And, the January on-feed number was 102% of last year. So we're still carrying more cattle compared to a year ago, but certainly no surprises in this report. I mean, it was just dead on with the average trade guesses. So I don't expect any real reaction. The one piece of data in this that we get quarterly is the steer and heifer breakdown on feed. And that's something that we've been watching, obviously, for the last several quarters, particularly that heifer number. The heifers on feed in this report came in still just a very slight decrease as a percent of the total cattle number. So 39.7% of the on-feed inventory was heifers. In October, that number was right at 40%. So it has not dropped very much. And in fact, the absolute number of heifers on feed is actually an all-time record for that data series back to 1994. So the short answer is it looks very much like we did, as we've sort of been anticipating. We did not apparently save any heifers in 2023. We've still been, through the end of the year, still been placing them in feedlots. We've got lots of heifers on feed right now.
And Derrell, with those numbers, is that showing that people aren't expanding their herds, but also hopefully not reducing their numbers?
Well, I think there's no doubt that we did probably see some reduction. Obviously, we'll have the January the January 1 estimates here in about 10 days. But we did not save any heifers. Yeah, and cattlemen all fall in my meetings told me that market's good. I need the money. We've been through a lot of extra expense the last couple of years due to drought and whatever. And so I got to sell, and so I think a lot of heifer calves got marketed, and apparently a significant number of them went into feedlots. So it looks like we're not carrying very many replacement heifers over into the new year.
Now, Derrell, wanting to talk about your Cow-Calf Corner newsletter and an article you wrote on that, and this one discussing the winter hay situation.
Yeah, so USDA made a big data dump there in mid-January. With the WASDE report, but it comes out at the same time as the annual crop production numbers, kind of summarizing last year, the final crop estimates, if you will. And included in that is the hay data, which often gets lost in the discussion of all the other crops. But so what we saw in that from last year, 2023, all hay production for the whole U.S. was up 6.3%. A little higher than the 2022 data, but, that's really not much to brag about because 2022 was horrible from the drought impact. So it was a very modest increase. Now, if you focus on the 10 major beef cow states, so the top 10 beef cow states, hay production was up about 22% in those states. So a little bit better. And across the board, it appears that we do have some relief in the hay numbers this time. They also included in this data December 1 hay stocks, which really tells you out of all that production last year, how much do we really carry into the winter to get us through the winter? And it's a similar story for the whole U.S. Hay stocks were up about 6.7%, 6.9%, modest increase. And in those top 10 beef cow states, the December 1 hay stocks were up 18.5%. So we get a little bit of relief. Now, if we keep having the kind of winter weather we've been having lately, we're going to burn through those stocks pretty quickly. But at least we have them. And so that's going to help a little bit.
And one more article from this newsletter wanting to mention is you did some recent traveling and saw some cattle out on winter wheat.
Yeah, it appears to me, just anecdotally, we don't have any data yet, but it appears that we've got a better wheat crop than we've had in several years, and we've got more cattle out on wheat. At least in what I saw in parts of Colorado and Oklahoma over the holiday period. And that seems to be the case. As I talk to producers, there's more stocker cattle out. So That's good. We've had the wheat. Now, this cold weather we've had recently certainly will stop the wheat growth, but we sort of expect that at this time of the year. Whatever wheat we've got is what we've got to work with now for another, about 6 weeks or so, if we're doing dual purpose wheat, where we're going to pull the cattle off by early March and then go ahead and harvest that wheat. And so, but I do think we have more stocker cattle out, and some of those are heifers. So that may be where some of our potential replacement heifers come from. I suspect that those decisions have not been made in many cases yet. Those producers that maybe they bought the heifers from the cow-calf producers who sold them, but they're still out there as stocker cattle. They still could wind up being replacement heifers before it's all over with.
And Derrell, if people would like to read these articles from your Cow-Calf Corner newsletter, how can they do that?
I tell you, the easiest way to do that, if you want to get the newsletter directly, is just send me an email to derrell.peel@okstate.edu and ask to be put on the newsletter list. It goes out to a lot of media places, but if you want to get it directly, we send it out every Monday morning.
Derrell, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our cattle market update for the week.
You bet. I'm happy to.
That was Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. If you would like to get on the list for the Cow-Calf Corner newsletter, you can email Derrell at derrell.peel@okstate.edu. That is DERRELL.PEEL@okstate.edu. I will link that in today's show notes on agtoday.net, as well as the articles from the Cow-Calf Corner newsletter. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Monday show discussing the Kansas Fertilizer Research Fund. And to talk about it, we're joined by K-State Soil Fertility Specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz and Director of K-Care at K-State, Susan Metzger. Dorivar, Susan, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Thank you.
As we're talking about this Kansas Fertilizer Research Fund and understanding how it functions, what is it?
Sure, I'd be glad to share some background information about that. So through the Kansas Department of Agriculture, there's what's called a fertilizer tonnage fee, and that collects a set-aside amount of money per ton of fertilizer that's sold or distributed in the state of Kansas. So right now that fee is set at $1.67 per ton. So of that $1.67, about $1.40 goes to the state's water plan fund, and of that 0.04 cents per ton goes to what we call in the state our Fertilizer Research Fund. And that's helped be managed through the Kansas Center for Ag Resources and the Environment, and also the College of Agriculture. And we use it to direct research that's going to help us identify efficient methods of fertilizer application, the best storage and handling, things that might improve even the safety of the handling of our fertilizer in the state. And we've been able to leverage those funds in really important ways to share important information with our producers and even our state agencies throughout the state. So typically we receive through that fund each year about $100,000, and we leverage that significantly on important studies. And I know Dorivar has some exciting news about a great example of some of that funded research.
Yes, some excellent examples of this. The use of these funds is really focusing on improving fertilizer recommendations. And one example is just the recent update we did to the fertilizer recommendations for crops in Kansas. So we're very excited to make significant updates to that, especially focusing on nutrients like nitrogen, which has obviously some significant impacts in terms of agronomic productivity, economics, and also some environmental implications. This type of work really require quite a bit of field research, and those are obviously very expensive. And like Susan mentioned, we are very fortunate to use some of these funds to actually leverage additional funding that we can use basically to have a bigger impact in terms of the type of research we're doing. Obviously in Kansas, we have different environments, different production systems. So being able to capture those different environments and environmental gradients are really important when we're talking about fertilizer recommendations in general.
And as we're thinking about fertilizer for this research fund, it's a little bit more than just the stereotypical fertilizer.
Yeah, so, really the research that we're able to leverage with these funds, when we think about fertilizer, it can be combinations of things like anhydrous ammonia, like Dorivar said in his example, applied nitrogen. It also includes phosphorus, potassium, and even micronutrients. So depending on the study and what the Kansas producers' needs are requesting to K-State for the types of research they need, directs the types of nutrients or fertilizer that we conduct our studies on.
So really trying just to take something that's kind of naturally happening and getting paid into a fund and giving that back to producers in this terms of research.
It's a great way to characterize it.
Yes, that's an excellent point, Shelby. Ultimately, what we want is for these to go back to the producers. And again, good quality and up-to-date fertilizer recommendations is really a key component there. One thing that's something we have to keep in mind is that production systems are improving continuously. We have new genetics, new production systems, and that require basically a continuous research and improvement of these fertilizer recommendations, which is something that needs to be quite dynamic and improving over time. And that's one of the key components here. One thing I also like to emphasize is that the way we manage this type of work here at K-State is really a team effort, and working with groups here in the Department of Agronomy and, of course, with Susan and others across campus is really the way we are trying to maximize the use of these funds. In the Department of Agronomy, we work with a group, Soil Fertility Working Group. And so in this case, we are able to bring different expertise, colleagues working perhaps a little bit more on the water quality side of things, perhaps a little bit more on tillage. And all of these components really have an effect in terms of fertilizer recommendations and how nutrients are basically used in cropping systems.
Dorivar, you mentioned your publication you've worked on that was funded by this Fertilizer Research Fund, but what are some of those other examples of projects that have been worked on?
That's an excellent question, Shelby, and we talk a lot about fertilizer recommendations, but there are many other studies that really support this type of work, and we do have several other projects that has been funded, for example, on water quality. The use of cover crops, for example, and the implications of cover crops in terms of nutrient cycling. And those are ultimately have a direct effect in terms of how we recommend fertilizers when it comes to efficient application methods and potential losses, especially to surface water. So those are just some examples of the type of funding that we are currently working on. And one of the key things about this type of research that I really value is that it's really information that can be transferred to farmers pretty much immediately. We are working in many cases actually with farmers' fields where we are doing some of these studies. And so we can essentially learn along with farmers through field-based through extension. And of course, ultimately, all of this information also goes back to other audience as well, agronomists that work closely with farmers. One group that's also benefit quite a bit from this type of work is, for example, soil testing lab that also providing recommendations to farmers. And again, this is not just soil testing lab from K-State, but obviously large commercial soil testing lab that is using this information and providing recommendations to farmers. Again, because really soil testing labs are not set up to do field trials. That's basically something that we tend to do in the university.
If people would like to learn more information about the Kansas Fertilizer Research Fund, how can they do that?
So I recommend that they go to the Kansas Center for Ag Resources and the Environment, or KCARE's website, and we have a section there dedicated to the Fertilizer Research Fund, and we're always updating that with new studies and findings that are available through the investment from the fund.
Susan, Dorivar, I appreciate you both so much for taking the time to join us today and share with us a little bit of information about the Kansas Fertilizer Research Fund.
Thank you, Shelby.
Thank you.
That was the director of K-Care, Susan Metzger, and K-State Soil Fertility Specialist, Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. I will put a link in today's show notes on agtoday.net if you'd like to learn more information about this fund. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and Brad Rippey.
How warm was 2023?
The average temperature for 2023, 54.4 degrees Fahrenheit.
That number, according to USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey, was 2.5 degrees above the 20th century mean temperature. And in terms of data and statistics, going back as far back as 1895,
it turned out to be the fifth warmest year over the last 129.
And in terms of the years that were warmer on average than 2023,
all four of those years have occurred in the last decade and a half, starting with 2012 and then continuing with 2016, 2017, and 2021.
The breakdown of average warm temperature by state last year looks like this.
It was the warmest year on record in 5 states across the southern and eastern United States. Starting in the south, warmest year on record in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. And then in the east, it was also the warmest on record in New Hampshire and Massachusetts.
However,
if you expand that to looking at the top 10 warmest years on record, it was a much longer list. It included every single state from the Mississippi River eastward to the Atlantic seaboard, and then also included the states of New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Washington state.
Of the 48 contiguous states in the Union, only one was not in the upper or warmer 1/3 of historical distribution.
That state that was the coolest ranking for the year was Nevada, but even there it was the 52nd warmest year during the 129-year period of record.
Rippey adds, among the climate contributors to a warm 2023,
very few cold outbreaks during 2023, and we had that epic heat wave across the deep south and general heat in many other areas of the country as we went through the year.
Now, how did the warmth play a role in precipitation last year?
If you look at the overall precipitation across the lower 48 states, the average value was 29.46 inches, just a little bit below or 98% of the 20th century mean of 29.94 inches. That marks the 43rd driest year on record of the last 129.
A state-by-state breakdown of 2023 precipitation totals indicate
we see our rankings ranging from the 8th driest year in Louisiana to top 10 wetness in all 6 New England states. That was a region that was hit by significant flooding twice during the year, starting in July and then ending again in December with another big flood event.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Once again, that was USDA's Rod Bain and Brad Rippey. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by Key State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts as he reminds people why it's important to leave wildlife wild. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show with some information from K-State Wildlife Department. And then today we're joined by K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shelby.
Drew, as we're having some cooler conditions, reminding people to keep wildlife wild.
I recently saw somebody put something on Facebook about what to do if you find hypothermic wildlife, and that got me to thinking about how, it's very natural for people who are caring to want to save critters if they see an animal that doesn't seem like it's doing well. And we tend to think about wild animals the same way that we think about our pets, or the same way that we think about livestock and those sorts of things. But it's really important to remember that the native wildlife that we have in different places are adapted to the conditions that are going to be in those places. And that means that they, even if it's not comfortable for them, they're adapted to live when it's really cold. They're adapted to live when it's really hot. They're adapted to get through drought. They're adapted to get through wet times. And when we try and save those critters, oftentimes we can sort of get in the way of either nature taking its course or that animal actually having the best chance it can have.
What are some of those things that they do to adapt?
If we're thinking about getting through the cold, one of the things that we see mammals and birds do a lot is either ruffle up or fluff up their feathers, or, of course, a mammal's fur can fluff up as well. And that is allowing more air to be trapped in between that outer layer of fur or feathers in the body. So it's increasing the insulative value and allowing them to stay warm. Another thing is that when times are good, when food is really abundant, most of our native wildlife really try and build up fat reserves. And that does a couple of things for them. It allows them to have more fat to burn when they need to stay warm. It also allows them to get through lean times when food's harder to access. So right now, a lot of Kansas has snow cover. A lot of our critters might have a little bit more of a difficult time getting to food if they're eating grain and those sorts of things. And so those fat reserves help them get through those times.
Why is it really important then for people just to leave that wildlife alone?
Yeah, so, there's lots of different reasons that it's better to just leave them alone. Of course, I mentioned one thing is that, it's really just nature taking its course. We have a surplus of animals for most populations, unless it's a threatened or endangered species, and some critters die. And those are not fun things to think about, but that's the reality. If we are trying to rescue a critter, we can also expose ourselves to injuries from wildlife. It's a common time for people to get bit when they're handling wildlife. Even if that critter looks like it's doing really poorly, they still may react and bite you if you're trying to save them. They might claw you. That can, of course, injure you, but it can also expose you to diseases, right? And that's not something that we want to do either.
And in urban settings, if you think something is wrong or maybe an animal is putting you at risk, what should people do?
In the country, it's pretty easy to just walk away from an animal and understand that it may die, but you're not putting yourself at risk. But in town, there may be a lot of people, there may be a lot of pets around. So I would just recommend that you call your local wildlife officials. That could be animal control if you're in town. It could be a game warden. It could be your wildlife biologist. But let them make the decision about what's going to happen to that animal rather than trying to save it yourself, because most people aren't equipped to do that. And, we really don't have the resources to try and save every critter that might starve to death or be cold.
And why maybe for the babies, if you see a stranded baby, why not take it?
That's another thing that it's not common right now for us to be running into fawns, but here before too long in the spring, we're going to start seeing fawns and other young wildlife. And oftentimes the mother will hide that baby or will help it get into a spot where it can hide, especially if we're thinking about deer fawns. And people will think that they're rescuing that animal that's actually doing just fine. It's doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's hiding, and then it's taken away from its mother. It's brought into captivity where we have more challenges trying to raise that animal and then condition it to act like a wild animal and actually have a good chance of survival. So if you come across young wildlife, leave them alone. Let wildlife be wild. That's the best chance that they have to survive and have a good life.
That was K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.